Racist police officers arrested a black woman, but when her true identity was revealed, they were left in shock. They thought they were enforcing the law, but in reality, they were acting on their own biases. Their mocking words and condescending behavior quickly turned into stunned silence and fear when they discovered that the person they treated like a criminal was actually the chief of police, their superior. Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone's assumptions were completely shattered? Or have you experienced being unfairly judged by people who didn't truly know who you were? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. The patrol car cruised slowly down a quiet suburban street, its tires crunching against loose gravel. Officer Jake Morrison, seated in the driver's seat, tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the sidewalks with the detached scrutiny of a man bored but looking for action. His partner, Officer Eric Stanton, leaned back in the passenger seat, absently fiddling with the radio until a report crackled through. Got a 1062. Possible burglary in progress reported near Grove Avenue. No clear suspect description. The dispatcher's voice buzzed. Jake's eyes flicked to the sidewalk ahead, locking onto a lone figure. Sandra Davis. She was walking slowly, a leather-bound notebook in hand, pausing occasionally to glance at houses or jot something down. "Look at that," Jake said, his voice laced with suspicion. "What's she doing out here?" Eric glanced up, his brows furrowing. "Not exactly blending in, is she? Middle of the day, looking around like that. Doesn't belong here," Jake muttered, making a sharp turn and pulling the car to the curb just ahead of Sandra. His hand instinctively drifted toward the holster at his hip as he stepped out of the car. "Excuse me, ma'am," Jake called out, his tone already edged with authority. Sandra stopped mid-step and turned toward the officers, her expression calm but wary. "Can I help you, officers?" she asked evenly, clutching the notebook close to her side. "Help us? More like you need to help yourself," Jake shot back, taking a step closer. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Sandra tilted her head slightly. "I don't understand the question. Is walking down the street now a crime?" Jake narrowed his eyes. "Don't get smart with me. We got a report of suspicious activity in the area, and you're looking pretty suspicious." "Suspicious how?" Sandra asked, her voice calm but firm. Her steady tone only seemed to irritate Jake more. Eric stepped forward, trying to play the mediator. "Listen, ma'am, we're just doing our job. Maybe you can explain what you're doing here? You live around here?" "Yes, I do," Sandra replied. "And as far as I know, walking in your own neighborhood doesn't require a justification." Jake scoffed, his fingers twitching near his weapon. "Carrying that notebook around, looking at houses like that? You expect us to believe you're just taking a stroll?" Sandra raised an eyebrow. "This is my neighborhood. That notebook is private, and frankly, I don't owe you an explanation for why I'm walking down the street." The tension thickened, and a small group of bystanders began to gather at a distance, their curiosity piqued by the scene. Jake noticed them, but didn't ease up. Instead, he took another step toward Sandra. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stop with the attitude and answer the questions properly," Jake barked, his voice rising. Sandra didn't flinch. Her steady gaze locked onto his, unyielding. "And I'm going to need you to explain what exactly I've done wrong." Jake's patience snapped. "All right, that's enough. Hands where I can see them." Sandra's eyes widened slightly, but she complied, raising her hands slowly, her notebook still clutched in one hand. "You're making a mistake," she said, her tone laced with warning. Eric shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Jake. "Jake, maybe we should—" "No, Eric. She matches the profile. Let's not complicate this." Jake cut him off sharply. The crowd of onlookers murmured louder as Jake's hand closed around his weapon. Sandra's calm voice cut through the noise. "Officers, think carefully about what you're doing." "You don't want to do this," Jake sneered. "Oh, I think we do." With that, Jake reached out and grabbed Sandra's arm, pulling her roughly toward the squad car. Eric hesitated for a moment before helping his partner cuff her, avoiding her piercing glare as she stood silently, her dignity intact despite the situation. "Cuffed for walking home," Sandra said softly, her voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. "Interesting use of justice." Jake ignored her, turning toward the bystanders. "Everyone back off. There's nothing to see here." A man holding up his phone to record spoke up. "Looks like plenty to see from here," he said, his tone challenging. Jake stepped toward him, his voice hard. "Put the phone down, or you're next." The man didn't budge, and Jake's eyes flicked toward Eric, who shook his head slightly. "Let it go, Jake," Eric muttered. "Get her in the car," Jake snapped, turning his frustration back to Sandra. Sandra didn't resist as they placed her in the back seat, but her words lingered. "You've made a terrible mistake." You'll find out soon enough. Jake slammed the car door shut, muttering under his breath. We'll see about that. The scene had escalated from suspicion to confrontation, with Sandra maintaining her composure despite the officer's aggressive tactics. Unbeknownst to Jake and Eric, their decision to arrest her would set off a chain of events that would not only expose their biases, but also upend their careers. Sandra Davis sat quietly in the back seat of the squad car, her face calm, but her eyes sharp, scanning her surroundings. She had been through situations like this before, not as a suspect, but as the chief of police for the very precinct Jake and Eric worked under. She had deliberately kept her role low profile while conducting routine evaluations of the neighborhood, something she did regularly to stay in touch with the community. Today, however, her unassuming approach had backfired spectacularly. Jake glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his lips curling into a sneer. "So what's your story? Out here casing houses?" Sandra didn't rise to his bait. Instead, she responded evenly. "I already told you I live here. That notebook you seem so concerned about. Notes about improving safety in the area. You might have asked instead of assuming." Jake laughed harshly. "Yeah, sure. Safety. Funny how people like you always have some excuse. We're not buying it." Eric turned slightly in his seat to face her. His tone was colder, more calculated. "Let's cut the act. You've been walking around, writing things down, looking at houses. That's not normal. Don't play innocent. We know what's going on." Sandra leaned back, her demeanor unwavering. "What's going on is that two officers are harassing a resident without cause. And the more you talk, the clearer your intentions become." Eric's eyes narrowed. "You're not in a position to make accusations, so why don't you drop the attitude?" Before Sandra could respond, Jake parked the car outside the precinct. He stepped out and opened the back door. "All right, out. Let's get this over with." As Sandra exited, she noticed a few onlookers outside the station, some lingering from the earlier confrontation. One man, still holding his phone, called out, "Hey lady, you good?" Sandra nodded briefly. "I'm fine, thank you." Jake's patience wore thin. "Didn't I tell you to stop recording? Unless you want to join her in there, I suggest you back off." The man raised his phone defiantly. "It's a free country. Last I checked, filming wasn't illegal." Jake took a step forward, his hand hovering near his holster. "You really want to test me right now?" "Jake!" Eric hissed, grabbing his arm. "Let it go. Let's get her inside." Jake reluctantly stepped back, muttering under his breath as he shoved the door to the station open. Inside, Sandra was led to a holding area, her movements controlled but deliberate. Jake gestured for her to sit on a metal bench as he began filling out paperwork at a nearby desk. Eric leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You could have made this easy, you know. A little cooperation goes a long way." Sandra finally allowed a trace of a smile to cross her face. "Cooperation? I asked for the reason I was stopped, and you escalated it into an arrest. That's not cooperation. That's harassment." Jake looked up from his papers. "You think you're clever, don't you? Let me tell you something. You're not walking out of here without consequences." Sandra met his gaze, her tone sharper now. "And you're digging yourself a deeper hole with every word. I suggest you start thinking about what you'll say when this goes in front of a judge." Jake slammed his pen down. "I don't need a lecture from someone like you." Eric stepped in, trying to regain control. "Jake, focus. Let's process her and move on." As Jake finished the paperwork, Sandra addressed him directly, her voice low but firm. "You're not going to get away with this. I've been in law enforcement long enough to know the rules, and how badly you've broken them." Jake smirked. "Long enough in law enforcement? What, you a mall cop or something?" Sandra didn't answer. She simply watched him, her silence unnerving him more than words ever could. Eric, sensing the tension, gestured toward Jake. "Let's just take her statement and be done with it. No need to drag this out." Jake ignored him, turning back to Sandra. "You want to play tough? Fine. Let's see how tough you are when you're sitting in a cell." Eric sighed and approached the desk sergeant, muttering something inaudible. The sergeant glanced at Sandra, then back at Eric, his expression skeptical. "Something wrong?" the sergeant asked. Eric hesitated. "No, it's just, I don't know. She's not acting like a usual suspect." The sergeant frowned. "Maybe because she's not. Did you actually check her ID?" Eric faltered, realizing they hadn't. "We didn't get that far." The sergeant looked unimpressed. "Might want to." "Before you go making this worse." Back at the desk, Jake's frustration grew as Sandra continued to meet his hostility with calm defiance. "You really think you're untouchable, don't you?" Sandra folded her arms. "No, Officer Morrison. I know exactly how the system works. And soon, so will you." Eric returned, gesturing to Jake. "Let's just book her and move on." "Not yet," Jake snapped. "I want to see how far she'll push this." Sandra finally stood, her presence commanding despite the circumstances. "You're about to find out." Sandra's calm but assertive demeanor had already begun to unsettle Eric, while Jake's arrogance blinded him to the gravity of his mistake. The situation was poised to spiral further as Sandra prepared to take control of the narrative, setting the stage for revelations that would shake both officers to their core. Sandra stood still, her wrists tightly cuffed behind her back as Jake gripped her arm, leading her toward the patrol car. Her composed expression was a stark contrast to Jake's simmering frustration. Around them, murmurs from bystanders grew louder. Phones were raised, and eyes bore into the officers, their curiosity turning into quiet judgment. "Keep moving!" Jake barked, shoving Sandra forward when she slowed slightly. She turned her head just enough to glance at him. "You're making a mistake. And the worst part? You don't even realize it yet." Jake's jaw clenched. "The only mistake here is you thinking you're above the law. Newsflash, you're not." Eric trailed behind, scanning the crowd nervously. "Jake, we've got an audience. Maybe we should tone it down a bit." Jake threw an impatient glance over his shoulder. "Let them watch. Maybe they'll think twice about pulling the same stunt." Sandra shook her head, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Is that what you think this is? A stunt? You're projecting your ignorance onto me, and it's going to cost you." Jake shoved open the car door with more force than necessary, guiding her inside. "Save the lectures for someone who cares." As Sandra settled into the back seat, she fixed Jake with a calm but piercing stare. "You'll care soon enough." Jake slammed the door shut and walked around to the driver's side. Eric hesitated before getting into the passenger seat, glancing back at Sandra. "You don't seem too worried," he said, his tone almost questioning. Sandra didn't look at him, her gaze fixed straight ahead. "That's because I know how this ends." Jake scoffed as he started the engine. "Yeah, enlighten us. How does this end?" Sandra finally turned her eyes to the rearview mirror, meeting Jake's glare with her own. "With accountability. Something you seem unfamiliar with." Eric glanced at Jake, uneasy with the growing tension. "Let's just get back to the station, all right? We've done our part." Jake ignored him, his knuckles tightening on the wheel. "No, let her keep talking. I want to hear what other pearls of wisdom she's got. Come on, Mrs. Know-it-all? What else you got for us?" Sandra didn't hesitate. "For starters, you might want to review the policies on reasonable suspicion and probable cause. Because right now, you've got neither." Jake laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Probable cause? I don't need a legal lecture from someone like you. You were acting shady. That's enough for me." Sandra's voice sharpened, though her composure remained intact. "And that's why you're unfit to wear that badge. Because you think your assumptions are facts." Eric turned in his seat, his tone defensive. "Look, you were the one walking around, jotting stuff down and looking suspicious. We didn't just pull you over for fun." Sandra's expression hardened. "Suspicious to whom? To people like you? Or to a system that enables you to act on those biases unchecked?" Eric faltered, but Jake cut in before he could respond. "You think you've got all the answers, don't you? Here's the thing. You're in the back seat. We're the law. And right now, the law says you're under arrest." Sandra's voice dropped, quiet but firm. "You're not the law. You're a man with a badge, and you're abusing it." Jake slammed his hand against the wheel, his frustration boiling over. "Enough! I don't care who you think you are. You want to play tough. Fine. We'll see how tough you are back at the station." When they arrived at the station, Jake stepped out of the car, his movements quick and aggressive. He yanked open Sandra's door and gestured for her to step out. "Let's go. Try not to trip." Sandra exited without resistance, standing tall despite the cuffs digging into her wrists. "You know," she said as Jake gripped her arm, "there's still time to fix this. Admit your mistake and let me go. It'll save you the embarrassment later." Jake tightened his grip, pulling her toward the building. "Embarrassment. Lady, you're the one in cuffs. Remember that." Eric followed silently, his unease growing as they entered the station. The desk sergeant raised an eyebrow at the trio, his gaze lingering on Sandra. "What's this about?" he asked, directing his question at Jake. "Suspicious activity," Jake said curtly. "We caught her snooping around houses, taking notes. She's probably planning something." Sandra spoke up, her tone measured but cutting. "You might want to check the facts before taking his word for it. I requested to call my attorney, and I expect that request to be granted." Jake turned to her, his eyes flashing with anger. "You don't get to make demands here. You're in custody. You'll get a call when we say so." Sandra's gaze didn't waver. "And you've just added another violation to your growing list of misconduct. Keep it up." Eric stepped forward, trying to de-escalate. "Look, let's just process her and be done with it, all right? No need to drag this out." But Jake wasn't done. "You think this is a game?" he snapped, leaning closer to Sandra. "You think you're going to walk out of here and act like this didn't happen? Newsflash. You're not special. You'll face the same consequences as anyone else. Sandra's reply was calm but deliberate. You're right about one thing. I'm not special. And that's exactly why this is going to blow up in your face. Because if this is how you treat me, imagine what you're doing to people without the means to fight back. Jake's smirk faltered for the first time, but he quickly masked it with defiance. We'll see about that. Jake paced near his desk, flipping through Sandra's file with exaggerated confidence. His every movement radiated arrogance, as if he'd already won a case that hadn't even begun. Across the room, Eric sat on the edge of his chair, less certain but unwilling to voice his doubts. This is open and shut, Jake said, slamming the folder onto the desk. Caught her acting shady, resisted our authority, refused to cooperate. Textbook case. She's done. Eric hesitated before replying. Are you sure this is a good idea? Something feels off about all this. Jake's eyes snapped to his partner, his tone turning sharp. Off? What's off about it? She's a nobody who thought she could talk her way out of getting arrested. She's lucky we didn't slap her with more charges. Before Eric could respond, Officer David Collins entered the room, his expression a mix of curiosity and skepticism. What's all this I'm hearing about the woman you two brought in? Jake smirked. Nothing much, just some suspicious activity in the wrong neighborhood. We're filing charges to make sure she doesn't try anything else. David crossed his arms. Suspicious activity? Is that code for she didn't look like she belonged there? Because that's what the people outside are saying. Jake's smirk faded, replaced with a glare. You got something to say, Collins? Because if you do, now's the time. David didn't flinch. Yeah, I do. Did you even check her ID? Run her name? Or did you jump straight to cuffs because she made you uncomfortable? Eric shifted uncomfortably, but Jake stepped forward, his voice low and threatening. Listen, if you want to keep your head down and keep your job, I suggest you stay out of this. Otherwise, you might find yourself writing parking tickets for the rest of your career. David held Jake's gaze for a moment before shaking his head. You know what? Do whatever you want. But don't come crying to me when this backfires. He turned and walked away, leaving Jake fuming. Once David was out of earshot, Eric finally spoke up. Maybe he's right. We didn't run her info. What if we're wrong? Jake slammed his hand on the desk, cutting him off. We're not wrong, Eric. Stop second-guessing everything. This is the kind of case that makes us look good. Firm, decisive action. You want to be a leader someday. Then grow a spine. Eric didn't respond, but his discomfort was clear. Jake continued, flipping through the file again. I'll file the charges myself. Once this goes to court, it'll be her word against ours, and we know how that ends. In the holding cell, Sandra sat on the cold bench, her posture as calm as ever. When the cell door opened, Jake entered, a smug grin plastered across his face. Well, congratulations, he said mockingly. You've officially earned yourself a trip to court. Hope you've got a good lawyer. Sandra didn't move, her gaze steady as she looked up at him. So, you're really going through with this, even knowing how wrong you are? Jake scoffed. Wrong? Lady? You're delusional. You broke the law, and now you're going to answer for it. Sandra leaned back slightly, her calm demeanor unshaken. You're digging a hole you won't be able to climb out of. I'm giving you one last chance to stop this. Jake leaned closer, his smirk widening. And I'm giving you one last chance to admit what you were really doing in that neighborhood. Because once we're in court, you won't have any more options. Sandra met his gaze with quiet intensity. Court is exactly where I want this to go. It's the perfect stage to expose everything you've done. Jake faltered for half a second, but quickly recovered. We'll see who gets exposed. He turned on his heel and left, slamming the door behind him. Later that day, Jake submitted the paperwork to formally charge Sandra with trespassing and resisting arrest. Eric stood nearby, watching but saying nothing. You good with this? Jake asked, his tone daring Eric to disagree. Eric hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Yeah, sure. Good, Jake said, clapping him on the shoulder. Because once this goes through, we'll be the ones who look like heroes. Trust me. The courtroom buzzed with quiet chatter as people settled into their seats. Jake and Eric sat confidently at the prosecution table, their expressions smug. To them, this was routine, a simple case of enforcing the law. Jake leaned toward Eric, smirking. This'll be over in an hour, open and shut. Eric nodded, though his unease hadn't faded. He glanced around, his gaze landing on the doors at the back of the courtroom. The moment they opened, the air seemed to shift. Sandra Davis entered, her posture commanding, and her sharp navy suit tailored perfectly. Beside her walked a distinguished-looking man, her attorney, whose reputation for dismantling weak cases was well known. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as people began to recognize the confidence radiating from Sandra. Jake frowned, his smirk faltering. "Who brings a lawyer like that to a case like this?" Eric shifted in his seat. "She looks different," Jake waved it off. "Doesn't matter. She can dress up all she wants. It won't change what happened." Sandra took her seat at the defense table, her attorney whispering briefly in her ear before nodding. She glanced toward Jake and Eric, her expression unreadable. Jake glared back, masking his discomfort with bravado. The bailiff called the court to order, and the judge entered. The room fell silent as the trial began. The prosecutor stood first, confidently outlining the charges against Sandra. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that the defendant was acting suspiciously in a residential neighborhood, refused to cooperate with officers, and resisted lawful arrest. We seek to uphold justice by holding her accountable for her actions." Jake nodded subtly, as if to affirm every word. But Sandra remained still, her calm demeanor unshaken. When it was her attorney's turn, he rose with a commanding presence. "Your Honor, before we proceed, my client would like to address the court directly." The judge raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "Very well. Ms. Davis, you may speak." Sandra stood, the room's attention shifting entirely to her. Her voice was steady and deliberate. "Your Honor, members of the court, my name is Sandra Davis." She paused, letting the moment linger. "I am the chief of police for this district." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Gasps rippled through the gallery, and even the judge leaned forward slightly, his surprise evident. Jake froze, his face draining of color as he exchanged a panicked glance with Eric, who looked equally shell-shocked. Sandra continued, her tone unwavering. "On the day in question, I was conducting an unannounced evaluation of neighborhood safety as part of my duties. Officers Morrison and Stanton approached me with unfounded suspicion, escalated the situation without cause, and arrested me without justification. Their actions were not only inappropriate, but a blatant misuse of authority." Jake's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked to Eric for support, but Eric was too busy staring at the table, his hands clenched into fists. Sandra turned her gaze directly to Jake and Eric. "You assumed I didn't belong. You assumed I was guilty because of the color of my skin and the notebook in my hand. And instead of asking questions, you jumped to conclusions." The prosecutor, visibly rattled, stood quickly. "Your Honor, this revelation changes nothing. The defendant's position doesn't exempt her from following the law," Sandra's attorney immediately countered. "And yet her position makes it abundantly clear how egregious this situation is. If a chief of police can be treated this way, imagine the treatment others receive, those without a title or platform to defend themselves." The judge raised a hand, silencing both sides. He turned to Sandra. "Chief Davis, your role certainly adds complexity to this case. Continue." Sandra nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor. I have spent my career upholding the law and ensuring fairness in our community. What happened to me is not an isolated incident. It's a reflection of a systemic issue. Officers like Morrison and Stanton believe they can act without accountability because they assume no one will challenge them. Well, I'm here to challenge them." Jake finally found his voice, though it cracked under the weight of the moment. "Your Honor, we were following protocol. We acted in good faith based on the situation," Sandra's attorney cut in sharply. "Good faith? Is it good faith to arrest someone without verifying their identity? Without reasonable suspicion? To ignore their request for legal counsel?" The judge's gaze shifted to Jake and Eric, his expression stern. "Officers, did you verify Mrs. Davis's identity before making the arrest?" Eric stammered, his words tumbling out. We didn't get that far. She was uncooperative." Sandra's voice sliced through the courtroom. "I wasn't uncooperative. I asked a simple question. Why was I being stopped? Instead of answering, they escalated." The gallery murmured again, the tide of public opinion visibly shifting against the officers. The judge leaned back in his chair, his tone heavy. "Chief Davis raises valid concerns. Officers, your actions will be thoroughly examined in the course of this trial." Jake slumped slightly in his seat, his earlier confidence evaporating. Eric stared straight ahead, his face pale. Sandra's revelation had turned the trial on its head. The officers, once certain of their victory, now found themselves on the defensive. their authority crumbling under the weight of her words. The courtroom wasn't just a venue for a legal battle. It had become a stage for exposing systemic failures, with Sandra determined to see justice served. The courtroom grew tense as the prosecutor called the first witness, a middle-aged woman named Margaret, who had been walking her dog near the scene of Sandra's arrest. Margaret approached the stand, adjusted her glasses nervously, and raised her right hand as the bailiff swore her in. The prosecutor began. Ms. Thompson, you were present during the arrest of Miss Davis. Could you describe what you saw? Margaret glanced at Sandra, her expression resolute. I was walking my dog when I saw two officers approach her. She wasn't doing anything wrong, just standing there with a notebook. But from the moment they spoke, it was clear they'd already decided she was guilty of something. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, shooting a glance at Eric. What do you mean by already decided? The prosecutor pressed. They weren't asking questions to understand. They were demanding answers, accusing her of things without any real reason. When she tried to explain herself, they cut her off, saying things like, "Don't play games with us." They even called her girl, like they were talking down to her. Sandra's attorney leaned forward, his expression sharp. The prosecutor continued, "Did the officers ever explain why they stopped her?" "No," Margaret replied firmly. They just kept accusing her of being somewhere she didn't belong. Jake couldn't stay silent any longer. He leaned over to his attorney and muttered, "This is all exaggerated." His attorney shot him a warning look, but Jake's frustration was evident. The prosecutor nodded and turned back to Margaret. "Did you hear any other specific remarks from the officers?" Margaret hesitated, her voice lowering slightly. "Yes." One of them said something like, "Let's see how tough you are now." It was humiliating to watch. At this, Jake stood abruptly. "That's not how it happened." The judge's gavel slammed down, silencing the room. His stern gaze fixed on Jake. "Officer Morrison, you are out of line. Sit down immediately or face contempt of court." Jake dropped back into his seat, his face flushed with anger, while Eric avoided eye contact with everyone in the room. The prosecutor called the next witness, a delivery driver named Mark, who had been parked nearby during the arrest. Mark's casual demeanor shifted to seriousness as he took the stand. "Mr. Johnson, could you tell the court what you observed?" the prosecutor asked. "I was sitting in my truck waiting on a customer when I saw the two officers approach her," Mark said, nodding toward Sandra. "It didn't take long to realize they weren't there to help. They were there to intimidate." "How so?" Mark leaned forward slightly. "They were loud, aggressive, and didn't give her a chance to explain herself. It was like they'd already decided she was guilty of something before she even spoke." "Did they use any specific language that stood out to you?" Mark hesitated before responding. "They called her girl more than once, like they were putting her in her place. And when the crowd started gathering, one of them, the taller one, threatened to arrest anyone who recorded them. It was ugly." Jake's fists clenched under the table. Eric's face turned pale, sweat beginning to bead at his temple. Sandra's attorney seized the opportunity. "Mr. Johnson, did you observe Ms. Davis resisting arrest in any way?" "Not at all," Mark replied firmly. "She stayed calm the whole time. If anything, it made the officers angrier. They were trying to provoke her, but she didn't take the bait." The prosecutor nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. No further questions." The final witness was a man named Charles, a retiree who had initially sided with the officers when interviewed at the scene. As he took the stand, his demeanor was conflicted, like someone wrestling with regret. "Mr. Reed, you've previously stated that you believed the officers were acting appropriately at the time of the arrest. Has your perspective changed?" Charles shifted uncomfortably. "At first, I thought they were doing their job. But the more I watched, the more I realized something wasn't right. They weren't treating her like a person. They were treating her like she was beneath them." Sandra's attorney leaned forward. "Could you elaborate on what you mean by that?" Charles sighed. "They kept talking to her like she was a criminal before she'd even said anything. When she asked why they were stopping her, one of them snapped, 'You don't get to ask questions.' It wasn't about keeping the peace. It was about showing power." The prosecutor asked, "Did you notice any specific comments or actions from the officers that stood out?" "Yes," Charles admitted. When she stayed calm, one of them said, "You think you're too good for this?" It wasn't professional. It was personal. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Jake leaned over to his attorney, his voice a harsh whisper. "He's twisting everything." The attorney ignored him, scribbling notes furiously. The prosecutor asked, "Did you observe any resistance from Ms. Davis?" Charles shook his head. "None. She didn't raise her voice, didn't try to walk away. She just stood there and let them dig their own hole." As Charles stepped down, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. The testimonies had painted a damning picture of Jake and Eric's actions, exposing their aggression, prejudice, and unprofessionalism. Sandra's attorney stood. "Your Honor, the witnesses' accounts are consistent and clear. The officers did not act with reasonable suspicion or lawful justification. Instead, they allowed their biases to dictate their actions, culminating in an unwarranted and humiliating arrest of an innocent woman, who, I remind the court, is their superior." The judge's expression was unreadable as he addressed the room. "We'll continue this matter tomorrow. Court is adjourned." The gavel struck, and the courtroom emptied slowly, leaving Jake and Eric sitting silently at their table. The weight of the witnesses' words hung heavy in the air, a grim foreshadowing of what was to come. The courtroom settled into an uneasy silence as Jake took the stand, his earlier confidence noticeably shaken. He adjusted his collar, avoiding eye contact with Sandra, who sat composed at the defense table. The prosecutor stood, arms crossed, ready to pounce on any inconsistencies. "Officer Morrison," the prosecutor began, his tone firm, "let's address the arrest of Ms. Davis. Can you explain why you deemed her behavior suspicious?" Jake cleared his throat, his voice strained. "She was walking through a neighborhood where we'd received reports of a burglary. She was carrying a notebook and stopping to look at houses. It didn't seem normal." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "Not normal. Officer Morrison, do you often arrest individuals for carrying notebooks?" Jake's jaw tightened. "No, but the circumstances, her demeanor, the way she was looking around, it raised red flags." "Red flags," the prosecutor echoed, leaning closer. "Tell me, officer, did you verify her identity before deciding she was a suspect?" Jake hesitated. "Not initially. She wasn't cooperative." The prosecutor pressed on, his tone sharpening. "Not cooperative, or she simply asked why she was being stopped. There's a difference, isn't there?" Jake's face reddened. "She questioned our authority. That's a sign of someone trying to evade responsibility." Sandra's attorney stood. "Your Honor, objection. The officer's assumptions do not justify unlawful arrest." "Sustained," the judge said, his tone neutral. "Officer, please stick to the facts." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "We followed protocol. We acted based on the information we had at the time." The prosecutor tilted his head. "So, protocol includes threatening bystanders who record arrests, telling someone they don't belong and calling them girl? Is that part of your training?" Jake's eyes flicked to the defense table, then to the judge. "I never said that." The prosecutor smirked. "Multiple witnesses testified otherwise, officer." "Are they all lying?" Jake stammered. I don't recall saying that." Maybe they misheard. Next, it was Eric's turn. He climbed into the witness box reluctantly, visibly uneasy. "Officer Stanton," the prosecutor began, "you were present during Ms. Davis's arrest. Do you agree with Officer Morrison's assessment that her behavior warranted suspicion?" Eric fumbled with his words. "Well, we thought it might. At the time, it seemed justified." "At the time?" the prosecutor interjected. "Does that mean you now believe otherwise?" Eric looked panicked, glancing at Jake, whose glare burned from across the room. "No, I mean, we acted according to what we thought was right. It's easy to look back and question things, but in the moment..." The prosecutor cut him off. "Did you or did you not order Ms. Davis to be handcuffed without verifying her identity?" Eric faltered. "It wasn't my decision alone. We both agreed." Jake's voice broke out from the table, loud enough to interrupt. "That's not true. Eric was the one who said to cuff her." The courtroom gasped audibly at the sudden outburst. Eric whipped his head toward Jake, his face twisting in disbelief. "Are you kidding me? You're the one who said she was resisting and needed to be restrained." Jake shot up from his seat, pointing a finger at Eric. "Don't put this on me." You were right there, going along with everything. The judge banged his gavel sharply, his voice cutting through the chaos. Enough! Both of you, sit down. Officer Stanton, continue your testimony without interruptions. Eric sat back, his hands gripping the edges of the witness stand. He took a shaky breath before speaking again. We both made the decision. We thought we were acting appropriately. The prosecutor leaned in, his voice calm but pointed. Thought? Or assumed? There's a difference, Officer Stanton. Did you have any concrete evidence that Mrs. Davis was involved in any wrongdoing? Eric's shoulders slumped. No. The prosecutor nodded slowly. Thank you for your honesty. No further questions. As Eric stepped down, the tension between the two officers was palpable. The courtroom was abuzz with whispered speculation about their crumbling alliance. Sandra's attorney rose, addressing the judge. Your Honor, it's clear that the officers' actions were based on unfounded assumptions and personal biases. Their inability to provide consistent testimony speaks volumes about their lack of justification for the arrest. Jake's attorney stood, his tone defensive. Your Honor, mistakes can happen in high-pressure situations. These officers were acting in good faith. Sandra, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, finally stood. Her voice cut through the room like a knife. Good faith? She said, her calm demeanor giving way to a sharp intensity. Good faith is protecting and serving the public, not humiliating and targeting someone based on appearance. The judge turned to her. Chief Davis, you may address the court. Sandra walked to the front of the courtroom, her voice steady but forceful. These officers claim they were following protocol, but protocol doesn't include profiling, belittling, or ignoring a person's rights. Their actions weren't mistakes. They were choices. Choices driven by prejudice and arrogance. She turned to Jake and Eric, her gaze piercing. You didn't see me as a person that day. You didn't see a fellow officer or even a resident. You saw a stereotype. And now, you're scrambling to justify what can't be defended. Jake opened his mouth to respond, but Sandra raised her hand, silencing him. Save it. This isn't about you anymore. This is about accountability. And that starts here. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of her words settling heavily over everyone. The courtroom was silent as Sandra Davis rose to address the court. Her calm, commanding presence filled the room, her movements deliberate as she stepped forward to face the judge. The weight of her words hung in the air before she even began to speak. Your Honor, Sandra began, her voice steady but imbued with authority. Today, I am not here as chief of police. I am here as a citizen. A woman who was profiled, humiliated, and arrested without cause. She turned, her eyes sweeping across the courtroom, briefly meeting the gazes of Jake and Eric, who both looked away. I've spent over 2 decades in law enforcement. I've trained officers, led investigations, and worked to build trust between our department and the community. But none of that mattered the moment I was stopped on the street. Her tone sharpened, her gaze hardening. To them, I wasn't a professional or even a person. I was a target. The prosecutor interjected. Chief Davis, could you recount the events of that day? Sandra nodded, taking a breath before continuing. I was conducting a routine evaluation in a neighborhood under my jurisdiction. It's something I've done many times before. Observing the area, taking notes on potential safety improvements. I wasn't hiding or sneaking. I was walking openly, doing my job. Her voice grew colder as she described what happened next. Then, Officers Morrison and Stanton stopped me. They didn't ask who I was or what I was doing. They demanded answers, accused me of being suspicious, and treated me like a criminal. She turned to the judge. When I asked why I was being stopped, I was met with hostility. They told me I didn't belong. They called me girl and made comments designed to demean me. When I remained calm and requested clarification, they escalated. Without evidence, without justification, they arrested me. Sandra paused, her jaw tightening as she steadied her breath. Your Honor, I am a black woman in America, and I understand the weight of that reality every day. But even with my position, my title, and my years of service, I was not immune to the prejudice that drives interactions like this. If this can happen to me, what hope do ordinary citizens have? The room remained tense, every word she spoke cutting through the silence like a blade. She turned her focus directly to Jake and Eric, her voice dropping to a dangerous calm. You didn't see me that day, she said. You didn't see a colleague, a neighbor, or even a law-abiding citizen. You saw a stereotype. You decided without evidence that I was out of place. And instead of exercising judgment or showing restraint, you chose to assert your power. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Sandra wasn't finished. You mocked me. You dismissed my questions. You ignored my rights. And all the while you believed you were untouchable, that your badge shielded you from accountability. But it doesn't. Not today. Sandra's attorney stood. Chief Davis, what impact do you believe their actions have on the broader community? Sandra's eyes softened slightly, though her tone remained resolute. When officers abuse their power, it doesn't just harm the individual. It erodes trust in the entire system. Every time someone like me is treated unfairly, it sends a message to the community that justice isn't equal, that the law serves some, but not all. Her voice rose slightly, carrying a weight that reverberated through the room. Law enforcement is built on trust. Trust that we are here to protect and serve without bias or prejudice. What these officers didn't just disrespect me. It disrespected the badge. It dishonored the oath we take to uphold the law fairly. Sandra turned back to the judge, her voice steady but charged with emotion. Your Honor, I'm not here seeking revenge. I'm here because what happened to me is part of a larger problem, one that goes beyond these two officers. It's about a culture that allows bias to thrive unchecked, where assumptions replace evidence and power is misused without consequence. Her tone softened briefly, but the words still struck with force. I don't want this to be just another case. I want it to mean something. Because if we can't hold those in power accountable, then the system fails all of us. She stepped closer to the bench, her final words cutting through the tension like a knife. Officers Morrison and Stanton didn't just make a mistake. They made a choice. A choice to let prejudice dictate their actions. A choice to treat me, not as a person, but as a problem to be dealt with. That's not just an abuse of power. That's a betrayal of everything law enforcement stands for. The judge leaned forward, his expression grave. Chief Davis, your testimony is compelling. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we proceed? Sandra nodded, her voice quiet but firm. Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to leave you with this. I wear this badge not as a symbol of authority, but as a promise, to serve and protect with integrity. But badges don't make us infallible. They make us responsible. And when that responsibility is abused, it's up to us to correct it. That's why I'm here. She turned and walked back to her seat, her steps measured, her composure unshaken. The prosecutor, Michael Hayes, rose from his seat with deliberate precision, his sharp gaze sweeping the room. He adjusted his tie, turned toward the jury, and began to speak in a voice that commanded attention. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we've witnessed in this courtroom over the past days is not merely a case about one woman's arrest. It's a case about the abuse of power, the failure of judgment, and the dangerous consequences of unchecked authority. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Let's strip this case down to its core. Officers Morrison and Stanton approached Chief Sandra Davis on a quiet street. Not because they had evidence of wrongdoing, not because they had reasonable suspicion, but because they assumed she didn't belong. They saw a black woman in a predominantly white neighborhood and jumped to a conclusion that she must be guilty of something. That's not policing. That's prejudice. Jake shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, but Hayes ignored him, keeping his focus on the jury. The defense has argued that these officers acted in good faith, that they followed protocol. But the evidence tells a very different story. Witness after witness described how these officers escalated the situation, mocked Chief Davis, and dismissed her rights. They didn't approach her to understand. They approached her to dominate. Hayes gestured toward the witness stand. Margaret Thompson told us she heard them call Chief Davis girl, a term meant to demean and belittle. Mark Johnson testified that one of the officers said, "Let's see how tough you are now," a statement dripping with arrogance and malice. These aren't the words of officers upholding the law. They're the words of men abusing their authority. He turned slightly, now addressing the judge. Your Honor, this behavior is not only unprofessional, it's unlawful. It undermines the very foundation of trust that law enforcement is supposed to represent. When officers like Morrison and Stanton act with impunity, it erodes public confidence and jeopardizes the integrity of the entire system. Hayes walked a few steps closer to the jury box, his tone shifting from factual to impassioned. But let's not lose sight of what makes this case so egregious. Chief Davis is not just another citizen, she's the chief of police. She's dedicated her life to serving this community, to building bridges between law enforcement and the people we're sworn to protect. And yet, even with her title, her rank, and her decades of experience, she wasn't immune to the biases of these two officers. He raised a hand, his voice steady but firm. Imagine, if this can happen to her, what chance does an ordinary citizen have? What about someone who doesn't have the knowledge, the resources, or the courage to stand up and fight back? That's the question you must answer today. Because this case isn't just about accountability for these officers. It's about the message we send to every citizen who places their trust in the justice system. Hayes turned to face Jake and Eric directly. Officers Morrison and Stanton claimed they were doing their jobs, that they were following protocol. But protocol doesn't include making arrests based on assumptions. Protocol doesn't mean ignoring a person's basic rights. And protocol certainly doesn't mean belittling someone for daring to ask why they were stopped. Jake's attorney stood. Objection, Your Honor. The prosecutor is being inflammatory. The judge waved him off. Overruled. Continue, Mr. Hayes. Hayes nodded, his tone sharpening. Thank you, Your Honor. Let me be clear. This isn't about vilifying law enforcement. It's about holding those within it to the highest standard. Officers are given incredible power. Power to detain, to arrest, even to use force when necessary. But with that power comes responsibility. And when that responsibility is abused, it is our duty to act. He took a step closer to the jury, lowering his voice slightly. This case is about justice. Justice for Chief Davis, who was humiliated and disrespected by the very people sworn to protect her. Justice for every citizen who has ever felt powerless in the face of authority, gone unchecked. And justice for the badge itself, a symbol that should stand for integrity, not intimidation. Hayes drew a deep breath, delivering his final point with unwavering conviction. The defense has asked you to excuse these officers' actions as mistakes, as decisions made in the heat of the moment. But let's not confuse a mistake with a choice. Morrison and Stanton made a choice that day. They chose to ignore Chief Davis's rights. They chose to escalate a situation that required no escalation. They chose to let their biases guide their actions instead of their training. He turned back to the judge, his voice resonating through the room. Your Honor, we cannot allow choices like these to go unpunished. If we do, we send a message that authority is a shield against accountability. We tell the public that justice bends to power, instead of power being held accountable to justice. Finally, he addressed the jury one last time, his words deliberate and piercing. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is more than just a legal proceeding. It's an opportunity to reaffirm what justice truly means. I urge you to look at the facts, to consider the testimonies, and to remember that no one, no matter their badge or rank, is above the law. Hayes returned to his seat, his closing argument leaving the courtroom heavy with tension. His words had not only dismantled the defense's narrative, but also driven home the broader stakes of the case. The jury sat in silent contemplation, and Jake and Eric's fate now hung precariously in the balance. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as Judge Carter adjusted his glasses and reviewed the notes before him. The weight of the moment was palpable. Each word he spoke would determine the fallout from a case that had captivated the room and beyond. Jake and Eric sat stiffly at the defense table, their earlier arrogance replaced with visible apprehension. Sandra Davis remained composed, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her expression unreadable. Judge Carter cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the silence. After reviewing the evidence, hearing the testimonies, and considering the arguments presented, it is clear that this case is about more than a single incident. It speaks to the heart of accountability within law enforcement and the impact of prejudice when left unchecked. He turned his gaze toward Jake and Eric, his tone hardening. Officers Morrison and Stanton, you were entrusted with authority, an authority meant to serve and protect the community without bias or malice. Instead, you abused that power, allowing your personal assumptions to dictate your actions. Your behavior during the arrest of Chief Davis was not only unprofessional, but a gross violation of the trust placed in you by this community. Jake shifted uncomfortably, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. Eric avoided eye contact, staring blankly at the floor. The judge continued, his voice rising slightly. The evidence presented against you is overwhelming. Multiple witnesses testified to your use of demeaning language, your failure to verify Chief Davis's identity, and your escalation of a situation that required no force. Furthermore, your inability to provide a consistent account of your actions undermines any claim that you acted in good faith. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly, his piercing gaze locking on to the two officers. Your conduct has not only damaged your credibility, but has also tarnished the reputation of the badge you wear. Law enforcement cannot operate without public trust, and it is actions like yours that erode that trust, making the job of every honorable officer exponentially harder. The tension in the room thickened as the judge began delivering his verdict. As officers of the law, you are held to a higher standard. You are expected to act with integrity, fairness, and respect for the rights of all citizens. In this case, you failed spectacularly in every regard. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle before continuing. Effective immediately, Officers Jake Morrison and Eric Stanton, you are suspended without pay, pending a comprehensive internal investigation into your conduct. Additionally, should you return to active duty, you will be required to complete extensive anti-bias training and community outreach programs as conditions of your reinstatement. Jake's mouth fell open, his disbelief turning into a low murmur. Suspended? He muttered under his breath. This is ridiculous. The judge's gavel slammed down, silencing him. Mr. Morrison, I strongly advise you to watch your tone. I've been lenient in allowing this process to unfold, but your blatant disregard for accountability only reinforces the court's decision. Jake slumped back into his chair, his face flushed with frustration. Eric glanced at him but said nothing, his expression a mix of shame and resignation. The judge turned his attention to Sandra, his voice softening slightly. Chief Davis, while it is a travesty that you were subjected to such treatment, your composure throughout this ordeal has been commendable. You have turned this moment of injustice into an opportunity to shed light on a broader issue. Your actions and testimony have reminded us all of the importance of accountability, even for those who are tasked with enforcing the law. Sandra stood, her posture firm yet respectful. Thank you, Your Honor. But as I've said before, this case isn't just about me. It's about ensuring that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. The judge nodded. Your point is well taken, Chief Davis. This case should serve as a wake-up call, not only to the defendants but to law enforcement as a whole. Justice is not a privilege reserved for a few. It is a right guaranteed to all. As the judge prepared to adjourn, Sandra raised her hand slightly, signaling her desire to speak. The judge nodded, granting her the floor. Sandra turned to face the courtroom, her voice steady but powerful. I want to make something clear. This is not the end of a story. It's the beginning of a necessary change. What happened to me reflects a system that needs reform, a culture that needs to be held accountable. And while this verdict is a step in the right direction, it's only the first step. Real change requires continued effort from all of us. Her words echoed through the courtroom, drawing the attention of every person present. Jake looked away, his jaw clenched, while Eric closed his eyes briefly, his face betraying a hint of regret. Sandra's gaze swept across the room. To the officers here, and to everyone listening, remember this. Wearing a badge is not a shield against accountability. It's a promise to uphold justice, even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. And for those who fail to honor that promise, there must be consequences. The room erupted into a quiet murmur of agreement, a ripple of acknowledgement that Sandra's words carried weight beyond the confines of the trial. The judge raised his gavel one final time. This court is adjourned. As the courtroom emptied, reporters swarmed the hallway outside, but Sandra walked past them with quiet resolve, her head held high. She paused briefly at the exit, glancing back toward Jake and Eric, who remained seated at the defense table, their faces etched with the realization that their actions had brought them to this point. Sandra stepped out into the sunlight, her final words resonating not just within the courtroom, but in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed the trial. This is not just about accountability. It's about redefining what justice should look like for everyone. The judge's verdict marked a turning point, not only for the officers involved, but for a system in desperate need of reform. Sandra's words left an indelible impact, setting the stage for a larger conversation about prejudice, accountability, and the true meaning of justice. The courtroom verdict spread like wildfire. Within hours, news outlets ran headlines that captured the essence of the trial. Chief of Police confronts prejudice within her own department. Social media erupted with videos from the courtroom and eyewitness accounts of Sandra Davis's arrest, sparking widespread outrage and calls for accountability across the country. At the heart of the uproar was a video clip recorded by a bystander during Sandra's arrest. The footage, which showed Jake's aggressive demeanor and Eric's complicit silence, went viral. It was impossible to ignore. People from all walks of life weighed in, with hashtags like Dojan Justice for Sandra and Reform the Force trending for days. In the weeks following the trial, protests erupted outside the precinct where Jake and Eric had served. Crowds gathered with signs that read, "Stop Racial Profiling" and "No Badge Above the Law." Chants demanding reform echoed through the streets, amplifying a growing national conversation about systemic bias in policing. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Officers avoided eye contact, their usual camaraderie replaced with unease. Captain Andrews, who oversaw the station, addressed his team in a hastily arranged meeting. "We need to talk about what's happening outside," Andrews began, his voice measured but firm. "This case has put a spotlight on all of us. And whether we like it or not, the public is watching." One officer raised his hand hesitantly. "Captain, some of us feel like we're being unfairly targeted because of what Morrison and Stanton did. Not all of us are like them." Andrews's tone hardened. "Then prove it. This isn't about pointing fingers. It's about taking a hard look at ourselves and the culture we've allowed to grow here. If we don't change, we'll lose the trust of the people we swore to protect. And without that trust, we're nothing." The room fell silent. The captain's words hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder that the fallout from the trial was far from over. Meanwhile, Sandra Davis found herself thrust into the spotlight. Invitations to speak at community events, colleges, and even national forums flooded her inbox. While she accepted some, she remained cautious about becoming the face of a movement. "This isn't about me," Sandra said during an interview with a prominent news anchor. "This is about accountability. It's about making sure that no one, regardless of their position or background, is treated the way I was." The anchor leaned forward. "Chief Davis, what do you say to critics who argue that this case has unfairly painted all officers as corrupt or biased?" Sandra's response was measured. "I understand their frustration, but this isn't about vilifying law enforcement. It's about addressing the flaws within the system that allow bad actors to thrive. If we ignore those flaws, we fail not only the public, but the officers who genuinely want to serve with integrity." Her words resonated, sparking discussions across the country about how to implement meaningful reform without alienating law enforcement. At the protest outside the precinct, tensions flared as a group of counter-protesters arrived, holding signs that read, "Support our police" and "Law and Order First." Shouting matches broke out, and for a moment, it seemed like the situation might spiral out of control. Sandra arrived unannounced, stepping into the center of the crowd with a calm yet commanding presence. The protesters fell silent as she addressed them. "I understand your anger," Sandra began, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "I've felt it too. But this isn't about division. It's about coming together to demand better, not just for the community, but for law enforcement as well." A counter-protester called out, "What about the officers who are doing their jobs right? Why should they pay for the mistakes of a few?" Sandra turned toward him, her gaze steady. "They shouldn't. And that's why reform is so important, because it protects the good officers by holding the bad ones accountable. This isn't about tearing down the system. It's about building it back stronger, fairer, and more just." Her words diffused the tension, and the crowd dispersed peacefully later that day. Within the department, changes began to take root. Mandatory anti-bias training was implemented, along with monthly community outreach programs designed to rebuild trust. Officers were paired with community leaders to address local concerns, creating a dialogue that had been absent for years. Jake and Eric, however, faced a much harsher reality. Suspended without pay and the subjects of an internal investigation, they became symbols of the department's failure to self-regulate. Jake, still defiant, gave a brief interview to a local station, claiming he was the victim of a media witch hunt. Sandra addressed his remarks indirectly during a town hall meeting. "Accountability isn't persecution," she said. "It's a necessary step toward justice. If you can't accept that, then you have no business wearing the badge." The ripple effects of the case extended far beyond Sandra's precinct. Other departments across the country began reevaluating their policies, implementing stricter guidelines for stops and arrests. In some cities, civilian oversight boards were established to review complaints against officers, ensuring greater transparency. Community members felt empowered to share their own stories of injustice, many of which mirrored Sandra's experience. Her case became a rallying cry, proof that standing up to abuse of power could lead to meaningful change. In a final public statement, Sandra reflected on the broader impact of her case. Standing at a podium surrounded by reporters, she addressed the nation. "This is not the end of the conversation," she said firmly. "It's the beginning of a movement, one that demands accountability, transparency, and justice for everyone, regardless of who they are or where they come from." She paused, her gaze unwavering. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with moments like this. Moments where we refuse to accept the status quo and push for something better. For our communities, for our officers, for our future. The applause that followed was loud and sustained, a testament to the impact of her words and the journey that lay ahead. Sandra Davis stood at the podium outside the courthouse, facing a crowd of reporters, community members, and activists. The trial had concluded, but its impact was far from over. With cameras capturing every word, Sandra began her closing remarks, her voice steady and resolute. "This case was never about me," she said, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. "It was about justice, not just for one person, but for everyone who has ever been silenced, dismissed, or treated unfairly by those who are supposed to protect them." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Justice is not a privilege. It is a right. And it doesn't bend for power, rank, or influence. It must apply equally to all, or it means nothing at all. Her statement was met with murmurs of agreement, the crowd captivated by her calm yet unyielding demeanor. Sandra turned her focus to the broader message. The verdict today was a step in the right direction, but it is not the finish line. It is a reminder that accountability must be a cornerstone of our system. When those in power abuse their authority, it is our duty, not just as individuals, but as a society, to hold them accountable. If we fail to do that, we fail ourselves. Her tone sharpened, each word cutting through the noise of distant camera shutters. But accountability alone is not enough. Change requires action. It requires us to look at the systems we've built, to acknowledge their flaws, and to commit to making them better. That work is not easy. It's uncomfortable. It's messy. But it's necessary. Sandra stepped down from the podium, walking toward a group of community members who had supported her throughout the trial. Among them was Margaret Thompson, the dog walker who had testified on Sandra's behalf. Margaret extended her hand, her expression filled with gratitude. "Thank you," Margaret said simply. Sandra shook her hand firmly. "Thank you for speaking up. People like you make the difference." Nearby, a young activist approached nervously. "Chief Davis," she began, her voice wavering, "your case inspired me to start organizing in my own neighborhood. It's small, but we're trying to address some of the same issues you faced." Sandra smiled warmly. "That's how it starts. Small steps lead to big changes. Keep pushing, and don't let anyone tell you it's not worth it." The scene outside the courthouse was a stark contrast to the trial's early days. Where there had been tension, anger, and division, now there was a sense of unity and purpose. Yet Sandra knew that the road ahead remained long and uncertain. Inside the precinct, the ripple effects of the trial continued to unfold. Officers who had once dismissed concerns about bias and accountability were now attending mandatory training sessions. Jake and Eric, suspended without pay and awaiting the results of an internal investigation, had become cautionary tales, a reminder that no one was above the law. In a meeting with her team, Sandra addressed the department directly. "This trial exposed some hard truths about our profession," she said, her voice firm but compassionate. "But it also gave us an opportunity to rebuild, to regain the trust we've lost, and to prove that we are worthy of the badges we wear." One officer raised his hand. "Chief, how do we move forward? How do we repair the damage?" Sandra's response was immediate. "We start by listening. To each other, to the community, to the people we're here to serve. And then we act, not out of fear or obligation, but out of a genuine commitment to do better." As Sandra prepared to leave the courthouse for the final time, she paused at the steps, turning to address the crowd one last time. "This is not the end of a story," she said, her voice rising above the hum of the gathering. "It is the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where justice is not just a word we use, but a principle we uphold. Where power is not a weapon, but a responsibility. And where every person, regardless of their race, gender, or status, knows they are seen, heard, and protected." The crowd erupted into applause, a spontaneous outpouring of support and hope. Sandra descended the courthouse steps, her head held high, flanked by supporters and allies. The weight of the trial, the scrutiny, and the challenges she had faced were still fresh, but so was the sense of accomplishment. She had taken a stand, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. As she walked away, the crowd parted, their cheers and applause following her down the street. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The impact of her actions, her words, and her unwavering resolve would echo far beyond that moment, driving conversations, reforms, and change in communities across the country. Sandra Davis's story isn't just about one woman's fight for justice. It's about the power of accountability, the courage to confront prejudice, and the potential for change when people refuse to stay silent. Her journey reminds us that standing up to injustice isn't easy, but it's necessary if we want to build a fairer, more equitable society. Now, the question is, what would you do if you witnessed an abuse of power? Would you stay silent, or would you speak up like Sandra and the witnesses who supported her? If this story inspired you, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who need to hear this message, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this one. Together, we can amplify voices that demand justice and accountability. Let's keep the conversation going.
The sharp sound of Lisa Johnson's heels against the marble floor echoed through the nearly empty parking garage. She clutched her briefcase tightly, her mind racing with the details of the trial she had just won. It had been a grueling day, but as always, Lisa carried herself with poise. Her dark blue suit was immaculate, her natural curls framing her face like a crown. As she approached her car, the sudden blare of a police siren made her stop in her tracks. Two officers emerged from their patrol car, the fluorescent garage lights casting harsh shadows across their faces. She immediately recognized them, Rick Thompson and Ben Carter, officers with a reputation that preceded them. She had heard whispers of their methods, their unchecked aggression, and their tendency to target people who looked like her. "Evening, ma'am," Rick said, his hand resting on his holster. The smirk on his face sent a chill through Lisa's spine. "Officers," Lisa replied, keeping her tone measured. "Is there a problem?" Ben circled her car slowly, his eyes scanning her license plate, her bumper stickers, and finally her face. "You in a hurry to go somewhere?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Lisa glanced at the time on her watch, willing herself to remain calm. "I've just finished work and was heading home. Is there something I can assist you with?" Rick stepped closer, his posture aggressive. "Work, huh? Mind telling us what kind of work keeps a lady like you out so late?" Lisa's heart pounded, but she maintained her composure. "I'm an attorney," she said firmly, holding his gaze. "I had a late session at court. If you'd like, I can show you my ID." Ben let out a low chuckle. "An attorney, huh? Fancy job for someone like you." Lisa's breath hitched. She knew exactly what he meant by someone like you. Her skin, her confidence, her success, none of it fit the narrative they wanted to believe. "I'd appreciate if we could keep this professional," Lisa said evenly. "If I've committed a traffic violation, let's address it. Otherwise, I'd like to be on my way. Rick's smirk faded. You seem awful eager to leave. Got something to hide. Lisa opened her briefcase, pulling out her ID and bar association card. Here's my identification, she said, extending it to him. Now, am I being detained? Rick snatched the ID, inspecting it with exaggerated scrutiny. What's the rush? We're just doing our job. Your job, Lisa said, her voice steady but firm, is to serve and protect, not harass and intimidate. Rick's face darkened, and Ben stopped circling her car. You've got a smart mouth, Rick snapped. Let's see how smart you are at the station. Lisa froze. Excuse me. Rick nodded to Ben, who stepped forward and grabbed her arm. You're resisting an investigation, ma'am, Ben said, his grip tightening. Lisa tried to pull back without escalating the situation. This is absurd. I've done nothing wrong, and you know it. Rick leaned in, his breath hot and heavy. You think your big words and fancy job mean anything to us? Out here, we make the rules. Lisa felt her knees tremble but stood her ground. You're making a mistake, she said through gritted teeth. My husband is Judge Marcus Johnson. He won't stand for this kind of abuse. Rick's laugh was sharp and cruel. Judge Johnson? Well, isn't that cute? You think his robe's gonna protect you out here? Ben shoved her against her car, pressing her arms behind her back as he cuffed her wrists. Lisa winced at the pain but refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. This is illegal, Lisa protested. I'll have both of you held accountable for this. Rick leaned closer, his voice low and taunting. Good luck with that, sweetheart. Nobody's gonna believe your story over ours. As they escorted her to the patrol car, Lisa's mind raced. Every humiliating step felt like a blow to her dignity. Her confidence, carefully built over years of hard work, felt as though it was being stripped away. Once inside the car, Rick looked at her through the rear-view mirror. You don't look so tough now, do you? Lisa met his gaze, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. You'll regret this. The ride to the station was agonizing. The officers exchanged crude jokes, laughing at her expense as if she were invisible. When they arrived, Lisa was marched into the precinct like a common criminal, her hands cuffed and her head held high. The stares from officers and staff burned into her skin, but she refused to let them see her falter. Name? The booking officer asked. Lisa Johnson, she replied, her voice clear. The officer's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly masked his reaction. Occupation? Attorney, Lisa said. Rick, standing behind her, chuckled. Better put unemployed on that form soon, he muttered. Lisa ignored him, focusing on the process. They fingerprinted her, took her mugshot, and led her to a holding cell. The cold metal bench and the smell of bleach made her stomach churn. She sat in silence, replaying every moment in her head, searching for anything she could have done differently. But deep down, she knew the truth. This wasn't about her actions. This was about her existence. Hours passed before the first rays of sunlight filtered through the barred windows. Lisa's resolve remained intact, though her body ached from the night's ordeal. When the guard finally came to escort her to the courthouse, she squared her shoulders and walked with purpose. The humiliation was far from over, but Lisa was determined. She knew who she was, and she knew the truth would prevail. As they led her into the courtroom, her eyes scanned the room until they landed on the judge's bench. There he was, Marcus Johnson, her husband, her rock, her champion. His expression was calm, but the fire in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't over. O silencio no tribunal era quais tangivel en quanto Lisa Johnson entrava na sala, suas algemas brilhando sob a luz artificial. Todos os alhas estavam nela, alguns curiosos, outros caios de julgamento. Lisa sentia o peso do olhar cultivo, mas sua postura era inabalável. Cada passo que dava era auto de resistência, lembrete de que ela não seria definida por aquela noite de abuso e humilhao. Atrás do banco do juiz, Marcus Johnson ajustou os óculos e fixou os olhos em sua esposa. Sua expresso era séria, profissional, mas Lisa conhecia aquele olhar. Ele estava furioso, mas controlava cada músculo de seu rosto como preciso de homem acostumado a carregar o peso de justiça. O caso do Estado contra Lisa Johnson, o escriveo anuncia, que brando o silencio. Os policiais Rick Thompson e Ben Carter, sentados a mesa de acuseo, mantenum uma expresso de confianca que berava o descaramento. Rick ate lanku pequeño sorriso para Lisa, como seo teatro judicial fos apenas mesum dia comum para ele. Senor Thompson, Senor Carter, vocês podem apresentar as acusicos? Marcus perguntou, sua vos firme como uma lâmina. Rick levantou se, fingindo uma postura de respeto. Meritíssimo, a foi detida flagrante por obstrequeo a justica e conduta de sordira. Lisa mantive o olhar fixo Marcus, esperando sua reacao. Ele apenas assentiu, gesticulando para que continuasse. Ela se recusou a cooperar com uma investigação legítima, tornando necessário o uso de força, Rick prosseguiu. Sua escala de palavras era meticulosamente calculada, mas Lisa nota como ele evitava detalhes específicos. Marcus inclinou-se ligeiramente para a frente. E que evidências os senhores têm para corroborar essas acusicos? Ben, que enteo havia permanecido silencio, finalmente se pronunció. Timos nossos relatorios e o depoimento de ambos os oficiais, meritíssimo. Marcus cruzou as mãos sobre a mesa. Entendo. Senhora Johnson, ele disse, virando-se para Lisa pela primeira vez desde o início do procedimento, decide responder às acusicos. Lisa se levantou lentamente, suas algemas tilintando. Sim, meritíssimo, respondo com calma. Primeiramente, gostaria de afirmar que sou uma advogada respeitada nesta cidade e que fui detida sem justificativa legal. Segundo, minha conduta foi absolutamente profissional durante toda intracao com os oficiais. Nenhum momento obstrui qualquer investigação. Interessante, Marcus disse, sua voz semi-moco aparente. Enteo segundo arai, apriseo foi infundada. Teremos que investigar isso mais a fundo. Rick abriu sorriso sarcástico. Com todo respeto, meritíssimo, timos procedimentos que seguimos rigorosamente. Neo se trata de caso de discriminaco ou abuso. Marcus o encaru, o silencio perando como uma tempestade prestes a explodir. Official Thompson, pup me de retórica. Quero feitos. Ha registros de video ou audio dessa interacao. Rick hesitou, e Lisa sentiu o armadar. Li tentu mascarar o desconforto com uma tosse, mas o livre tremor sua voz o traiu. Bem, as câmaras do nosso carro patrulha estavam funcionando, mas ainda não tivemos tempo de revisar as imagens. Interessante, Marcus repetiu. Vou ordenar que essas imagens sejam analisadas imediatamente. Ele fez uma pausa, olhando diretamente para Rick. Porque, se há algo que contradiz os relatórios, essa corte precisa saber. Rick trocou olhar rápido com Ben. O clima de confiança entre os dois parecia ter começado a rachar. Além disso, continua Marcus, arai menciona que sua detenção ocorreu sem motivo aparente. O que levou os senhores a abordá-la primeiro lugar. Ben Pigaria. Estábamos realizando uma patrulha de rotina no estacionamento e encontramos atitude suspeita. Suspeita como? Marcus insistiu. Ben abriu a boca para responder, mas pareceu reconsiderar suas palavras. Ela estava nervosa, meritíssimo. Nervosa, Marcus repetiu, o tom frio. Isso é tudo. Rick tentou intervir. Local conhecido por atividades ilícitas. Nos estávamos sendo cautelosos. Lisa finalmente interveio, incapaz de conter a indignação. Cautelosos. Vocês estavam me assediando sem qualquer justificativa. Silencio na corte, Marcus ordenou, mas o olhar que lançou para Lisa era quase imperceptivelmente encorajador. Antes que o clima pudesse esfriar, a porta da sala do tribunal se abriu, e advogado de promotoria entrou apressado, entregando envelope ao escrivão. As imagens de câmara do carro patrulha chegaram, meritíssimo, anuncia o escrivão. O coração de Lisa disparou. Ela não sabia o que exatamente aquelas imagens mostrariam, Mas tinha certeza de que a verdade estava do seu lado. Colocam as imagens, Marcus ordenou. A monitor foi trazido e posicionado para que todos pudessem assistir. Quando o vídeo cômico, a tensão na sala se intensificou. As voces de Rick e Ben preenchiam o espaço, suas palavras claramente audíveis. Uma advogada? Que piada, Rick dizia, rindo. Deve ser mais uma dessas que acam que sabem mais que a gente, Ben acrescentou, sua voz caia de desprezo. Lisa sentiu uma pontada de dor no peito ao ouvir a zombaria. Mas o que veio a seguir foi ainda pior. O vídeo mostrava Rica emperando contra o carro, a força desnecessária clara como o dia. No tribunal, a atmosfera mudou imediatamente. O público sussurrava, e mesmo o advogado de defesa dos policiais parecia desconfortável. Marcus assistiu impassível, mas Lisa nota como seus punhos estavam cerrados. Quando o vídeo terminou, ele se inclinou para a frente. Oficiais Thompson e Carter, cômico, sua voz como trabalho contido, pode-me explicar isso? Rick abriu a boca, mas nenhuma palavra saiu. Ben olhou para o chão, evitando o olhar do juiz. Pelo que vejo, Marcus continua, não houve nenhuma obstacão por parte de Rai. Pelo contrário, houve conduta inadequada de ambos os oficiais. Este tribunal não tolera abuso de poder, e asseguro que essas acos serão devidamente investigadas. Lisa sentiu misto de alívio e fúria. Ela sabia que a batalha estava longe de terminar, mas naquele momento, a verdade finalmente começava a vir à tona. Marcus voltou-se para o advogado da promotoria. PECO que conduzem uma investigação imediata. Quero relatórios detalhados sobre o histórico desses oficiais. Lisa, ainda algemada, olhou para Marcus com gratidão silenciosa. Ele havia cumprido seu papel como juiz, mesmo com o peso pessoal do caso. Quanto a Sra. Johnson, Marcus disse, alhando diretamente para ela, eu declaro que as acusações contra ela sejam retiradas imediatamente. O tribunal explodiu em murmúrios, e Ricky Ben pareciam mais tensos do que nunca. A humilhao que Lisa havia enfrentado ainda ardia, mas a dignidade com que ela suportou cada momento comunicava se transformar em algo mais poderoso, a esperança de justiça. The courtroom emptied slowly, but the tension lingered like a storm waiting to break. Lisa sat in the chair beside her attorney, now free from the shackles but still wearing the emotional weight of the night's events. Her hands rested on the table, steady but clenched, as if grounding herself against the tide of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Across the room, Rick Thompson and Ben Carter whispered furiously to their attorney, their confident demeanor from earlier now replaced with visible unease. Marcus Johnson remained on the bench, his face a mask of professionalism, but Lisa caught the fleeting moments when his eyes softened as they met hers. He had done his duty, kept his role as an impartial judge intact, but the personal stakes were evident in the slight tension of his jawline and the subtle clenching of his fists. As the last of the spectators filed out, Marcus addressed the room. Court is adjourned for today. All parties will reconvene at the scheduled time for updates on the investigation. He rose, his robes billowing slightly as he stepped down from the bench. Lisa met his gaze as he approached her, a flicker of warmth breaking through his stern expression. "We'll talk at home," he said quietly, his voice low but resolute. "Right now, I need to follow up on a few things." She nodded, understanding the weight he carried. "Thank you," she said softly. "No need for that," Marcus replied. "We're not done yet." Lisa left the courthouse, her attorney walking beside her. Outside, reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing and microphones thrust toward her. "Mrs. Johnson, how do you feel about the charges being dropped? Do you think justice was served? Do you plan to file a lawsuit against the police department?" Lisa raised her hand, silencing the clamor. Her voice was calm but firm. "I am grateful for today's outcome, but this is far from over. The actions of those officers represent a much larger problem, one that extends beyond me. I'll be working with my legal team to ensure accountability and to fight for systemic change." The crowd erupted with more questions, but Lisa turned and stepped into her car, the door shutting out the chaos. That evening, the Johnson household was unusually quiet. Marcus arrived home late, his usual controlled demeanor now weighed down by the events of the day. Lisa sat in the living room, a glass of water untouched on the coffee table. "You look tired," she said, breaking the silence as Marcus entered the room. "I am," he admitted, loosening his tie and sitting beside her. "How are you holding up?" Lisa hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Angry," she admitted. "Frustrated. Embarrassed. But most of all, determined." Marcus nodded, reaching for her hand. "Good. Don't let them take that fire from you." For a moment, the silence returned, but it was filled with an unspoken understanding. Lisa leaned back, closing her eyes. "They think they can get away with this, Marcus. I saw it in their faces even after the video played. They still believe they're untouchable." "They've been protected for too long," Marcus said, his voice low but fierce. "I've seen it before, officers like them hiding behind their badges, their actions excused or ignored. But this time, they messed with the wrong person." Lisa's eyes snapped open, meeting his. "This isn't just about me," she said firmly. "This is about everyone who's been in my position, who didn't have the resources or the platform to fight back." Marcus leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You're right. And I think we both know this isn't just about holding those two accountable. It's about fixing a system that allowed them to act this way in the first place." Lisa nodded, the weight of their shared mission settling between them. "So, what's our next move?" Marcus's expression hardened. "First, we need to make sure this investigation is thorough. No loopholes, no excuses. I'll use whatever influence I have to ensure that. And I'll start reaching out to allies in the legal and activist communities," Lisa added. "We need to build a coalition, make this a case that shines a light on the problem, not just the symptoms." Marcus's phone buzzed on the table, pulling his attention. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's the district attorney," he said, answering the call. Lisa watched as his expression shifted, a mix of surprise and frustration crossing his face. "Understood," Marcus said curtly before ending the call. "What's wrong?" Lisa asked, sensing the tension in his posture. Marcus set the phone down with a sigh. The officer's attorney filed a motion to suppress the video evidence. They're claiming it was improperly obtained. Lisa's anger flared. "That's ridiculous. The footage came directly from their own vehicle's camera. How can they even argue that?" Marcus shook his head. "It's a stall tactic, but it's one we can't ignore. They're trying to buy time, hoping to build a case around some technicality." Lisa leaned forward, her determination blazing. "Then we don't give them time. We stay ahead of them at every step." Marcus met her gaze, his expression resolute. "We will. But this won't be easy, Lisa. They're playing dirty, and we need to be ready for whatever they throw our way." The next day, Lisa met with her closest colleagues at her office. The group gathered around a large conference table. Files and notes were spread out, the energy in the room charged with purpose. "We need to build a timeline," Lisa said, pacing as she spoke. "Every detail from the moment I entered that parking garage to the second I was released needs to be documented." One of her colleagues, Andrea, nodded, scribbling notes. "We also need to look into their history. If they've done this before, we need to find the victims and bring their stories to light." "Already on it," another lawyer, James, said. "I've pulled up records of complaints against both officers. There's a lot of smoke, but no fire, yet. Most of the complaints were dismissed or buried." Lisa frowned. "That's no coincidence. Someone's been covering for them. And we're going to find out who," Andrea said. Lisa stopped pacing, her voice steady but fierce. "This isn't just about winning a case. It's about setting a precedent. We're going to expose every crack in the system, and we're going to make sure no one else has to go through what I did." As the meeting wrapped up, Lisa checked her phone, her inbox flooded with messages of support and inquiries from reporters. Among them was an anonymous tip. "Check internal police memos. There's more to this than you think." Lisa's heart raced. The fight was only just beginning, and the deeper they dug, the more she realized how high the stakes were. The tip Lisa received weighed heavily on her mind as she drove back home late that evening. She couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just about the two officers but something larger, something more systemic. The words from the anonymous message echoed in her head, Check internal police memos. There's more to this than you think. Lisa parked her car and stepped into the house, greeted by the faint hum of a news channel playing in the background. Marcus was in his study, leaning over a stack of papers with a pen in hand. "You're home late," he said without looking up. "So are you," Lisa replied, dropping her bag on the nearest chair. Marcus finally glanced up, his brow furrowed. "What happened?" Lisa handed him her phone, the anonymous message open on the screen. Marcus read it silently, his expression growing darker with each word. "An anonymous tip?" he asked, setting the phone down. "Yeah," Lisa said, crossing her arms. "It could be nothing, or it could be everything. Either way, we need to follow it." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. If there are internal memos, it means someone in the department knows more than they're letting on. But getting our hands on that won't be easy. Lisa sat on the edge of his desk, her determination unwavering. "I have a contact at the local civil rights organization. They've dealt with police whistleblowers before. I'll reach out in the morning." Marcus nodded but didn't look reassured. "You're taking a big risk. If someone's leaking this, they'll be in just as much danger as you." Lisa met his gaze. "Marcus, I'm already in danger. They targeted me because they thought I was powerless. If I back down now, they win." Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. "I know. He hesitated, the vulnerability in his voice surprising her. "I can't lose you." Lisa softened, leaning down to kiss his forehead. "You won't. We're in this together, remember?" He nodded, but his eyes betrayed the fear he was trying to suppress. The next morning, Lisa met with her contact, Olivia, a seasoned activist who had spent years exposing corruption in the city. They sat in a small cafe, their conversation low but intense. "I don't trust anonymous tips on their own," Olivia said, stirring her coffee. "But if this is real, we'll need more than just memos. We'll need whistleblowers, witnesses, something that ties it all together." Lisa nodded. "Do you know anyone inside the department who might help?" Olivia hesitated. "There's one person. Detective Karen Diaz. She's been vocal about reform, but she's walking a fine line. If she helps us, she's putting her career, and maybe her life, on the line." Lisa's stomach churned at the thought. "Can you reach out to her?" "I can try," Olivia said. "But if she agrees, you need to be ready. This could blow up fast." Later that afternoon, Lisa returned to her office, her team buzzing with activity. James approached her with a folder in hand, his expression grim. "We found something," he said, placing the folder on the table. Lisa opened it and scanned the contents. Inside were records of past complaints against Rick Thompson and Ben Carter, dozens of them. Excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation tactics. Most of the complaints had been dismissed without investigation. "This is a pattern," Lisa said, anger boiling under her calm exterior. "They've been doing this for years, and no one stopped them." Andrea, who had been reviewing the documents, chimed in. "It gets worse. Look at who signed off on the dismissals." Lisa flipped through the pages, her eyes landing on a familiar name, Captain James Harrell, the head of the precinct where Rick and Ben worked. "Harrell," Lisa said, her voice dripping with disdain. "He's been protecting them." James nodded. "And if the tip is right, he might be the one pulling the strings." Lisa's mind raced. The pieces were starting to fit together, but they needed more. "We need to dig deeper. If Harrell's involved, he won't go down without a fight." That evening, Olivia called with news. Diaz is willing to talk, but she wants to meet in person. Somewhere discreet. Lisa agreed, and they arranged to meet at a small park on the outskirts of town. The next day, Lisa arrived early, scanning the area for anything suspicious. She spotted Diaz sitting on a bench, her posture tense, her eyes darting nervously. "Detective Diaz?" Lisa asked, approaching cautiously. Diaz nodded, her expression guarded. "You must be Lisa Johnson." "That's me," Lisa said, sitting down beside her. "Thank you for meeting me." Diaz glanced around before speaking. "I don't have much time. If anyone finds out I'm here, I'm done." "I understand," Lisa said, keeping her voice calm. "But we need your help." Someone tipped me off about internal memos that could expose what's really happening in your precinct. Do you know anything about that? Diaz hesitated, her hands fidgeting. I've seen things, emails, reports that don't add up. Harold's been burying complaints for years, especially when it comes to Thompson and Carter. But it's bigger than them. Harold's got connections higher up, people who owe him favors. That's how he's kept it quiet. Lisa's heart pounded. Do you have access to any of those emails or reports? Diaz shook her head. Not directly. But there's a server at the precinct where all the files are stored. If you can get a warrant, you'll find everything you need. Lisa nodded, already calculating her next steps. Thank you, Detective. This could make all the difference. Diaz stood abruptly, her nerves getting the better of her. Just be careful. Harold doesn't play fair. If he finds out what you're doing, he'll come after you. Lisa watched as Diaz walked away, her words lingering in the air. Back at home that night, Lisa shared everything with Marcus. He listened intently, his expression grim. We'll need to move fast, Marcus said. I'll talk to the district attorney about a warrant. But Lisa, this is dangerous. Harold won't go down without a fight. I'm not afraid of him, Lisa said firmly. You should be, Marcus replied, his voice heavy. People like him don't just protect themselves. They destroy anyone who threatens their power. Lisa placed a hand on his. That's exactly why we have to stop him. For every person he's silenced, for every life he's ruined. Marcus nodded, his resolve matching hers. Then we'll do it together. The storm brewing around Lisa and Marcus showed no signs of slowing. Each step brought them closer to the truth, but it also brought them closer to danger. Harold's influence loomed large, and the fight ahead promised to test everything they believed in. The day of reckoning arrived with an intensity that felt almost tangible. Lisa sat in her office, surrounded by her team, each member focused on their respective tasks. The warrant for the precinct's internal server had been issued, and officers from the district attorney's office were already combing through files. Lisa, Andrea called out, rushing into the room with a laptop. They found something. Lisa stood, her pulse quickening. Andrea placed the laptop on the table, and the team gathered around as she opened a folder containing hundreds of emails. These are all from Captain Harold, Andrea explained. There's correspondence with high-ranking officials, requests to dismiss complaints, and even instructions on how to handle officers who might speak out. Lisa's eyes narrowed as she scrolled through the damning evidence. This isn't just a pattern, it's a conspiracy. One email stood out. It was from Harold to Rick Thompson and Ben Carter, dated a week before Lisa's arrest. The subject line read, "New priority." The message was chilling. We've got a high-profile target. Keep her in check, but don't go too far. We can't afford another scandal. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. They were targeting me from the start. The room fell silent, the weight of the discovery settling over everyone. Later that day, Lisa and Marcus sat in the district attorney's office, presenting the evidence they had uncovered. The DA, a no-nonsense woman named Eleanor Price, listened intently, her expression growing darker with each new revelation. This is enough to take Harold down, Eleanor said, closing the laptop. And it might be enough to expose the systemic corruption within the department. But it's not enough to stop them from fighting back, Marcus cautioned. Harold has powerful allies. He won't go down quietly. Eleanor nodded. I'll prepare charges against Harold, Thompson, and Carter. But you need to be ready for the fallout. This is going to get ugly. Lisa leaned forward, her voice steady. We've been in the fire since the beginning. We're not backing down now. The trial against Harold and his officers became the most high-profile case the city had seen in years. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community leaders, and citizens who had followed Lisa's story closely. Lisa sat in the front row, Marcus by her side, as the prosecution laid out the evidence. The emails, the video footage, and the testimony of Detective Diaz painted a devastating picture of systemic abuse and cover-ups. Harold, once the picture of confidence, now looked like a cornered animal. His attorney tried to argue that the emails were misinterpreted and that the video was out of context, but the jury's reaction made it clear they weren't buying it. Rick and Ben fared no better. Their smug demeanor from Lisa's initial hearing was long gone, replaced with visible discomfort as their past actions were laid bare. During a break in the proceedings, Lisa stepped outside for air. A crowd of supporters waited near the steps, cheering as she appeared. "Lisa, you're a hero," someone shouted. She smiled, though the weight of the trial still pressed heavily on her. "I'm not a hero," she said, addressing the crowd. "I'm just a woman who refused to stay silent. And I'm not the only one. There are so many voices out there that need to be heard. This fight isn't just mine, it's ours." The verdict came after 3 days of deliberation. Harrell, Thompson, and Carter were all found guilty on multiple counts, including conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. The courtroom erupted in relief and applause, but Lisa's focus remained on the faces of the men who had tried to destroy her. Harrell avoided her gaze, but Rick and Ben glared at her with a venom that sent a chill down her spine. "Justice is served," Marcus said quietly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Lisa nodded, but she knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. In the weeks that followed, Lisa and Marcus launched a community initiative to address systemic racism and corruption in law enforcement. They held town halls, organized workshops, and worked closely with local leaders to demand accountability and reform. Detective Diaz, now a key whistleblower, became a central figure in the movement, her courage inspiring others within the department to speak out. The case also led to statewide reforms, including mandatory bias training for officers, stricter oversight of misconduct investigations, and protections for whistleblowers. One evening, as Lisa and Marcus stood on the steps of City Hall after a community event, Marcus turned to her. "Do you ever regret getting involved in all this?" Lisa looked out at the crowd dispersing, their faces filled with hope. "Never," she said firmly. "This is what we were meant to do." He smiled, taking her hand. "I'm proud of you, Lisa." "Of us." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the weight of the fight still present but now shared. "We're not done," Lisa said softly. "But we've made a start." Marcus nodded. "And that's more than most people ever get." Together, they stood under the city lights, a united front against the darkness they had faced. The journey was far from over, but their resolve burned brighter than ever.